Hello everyone, and welcome to the first video of Raahi Explainer, where we take a particular topic or theme and try to understand it. Today, we will be kicking off with climate change, a topic that is hot in more ways than one. And there is so much jargon, so much technical terms, there is so much ideas around it. And while we all have a certain point of view, Raahi Explainer will bring it together so that you have a strong foundation of understanding to engage on this topic. Joining me today is an old friend and a strong climate champion, Sailee Rane, who is the creator of Sunny Climate, Stormy Climate, a newsletter that looks at the rosy things as well as the not so rosy things that are happening in the climate change movement. Sailee, super excited to have you for this explainer today.
Super excited to be here, Girish. Thank you so much for having me.
So, before we even begin, just a minute on how did you get interested in this question of climate change and this conversation on climate?
So, I think I've always been curious about climate change and what's happening. So I've always read a lot, whether it was fiction, non-fiction related to climate and what's happening. But I think over the last few years, I could just really see it, happening around me. And it was undeniable, right? So you could see temperatures increasing, you were seeing landslides happening, you were seeing floods happening, and it just became too real. And when you study climate change or global warming in environmental science in school, it is something that will possibly happen in the future. It just became like a reality of today. And so it came to a point where I felt that, hey, this is like the biggest challenge, our generation is going to face. And if you're not doing something about it, then, what are we even doing, right? So I think it just became very compelling for me to, kind of do something in this space.
So, what I want to walk with you today is trying to get the full picture around what is climate change, how did it happen, what can we do about it, where are we in that journey overall. So, just to get the basics right. So, what is climate change?
I don't think there's a definition, but broadly, the Earth's climate, right, or long-term weather trends have been changing over the last, 3, 4, 5 decades, right? So which means that our temperature ranges are very different from what they used to be. Some things like the rainfall patterns have changed, right? Wind movements have changed. And all of this together is what we call climate change, to put it very simply. It is also happening at a rate which is much faster than what we have seen before, and therefore is probably much faster than what humans and other living beings will be able to adjust to.
Okay, so going a little deeper, why should we care, right? Why does this matter? Why should it matter to us?
So we should care, or it maybe should matter to us because it's going to affect all of us, whether we like it or not, in more ways than we can imagine, right? So to very simply, the ways in which it will affect us is one that you're feeling. The temperatures are going up, right? So the Earth is becoming warmer. It's becoming so hot. So NASA put it as the Earth is having a fever, and I thought that was a great way to put it, right? That's really how hot it's feeling. All our cities, right, are seeing heat waves. So that's one. You're seeing a lot of extreme weather events, and probably what something maybe we all experienced sometime, right, in the last couple of years. Fun statistic, but last year, out of the 365 days in the year, India experienced some extreme weather event on at least 300 of those days.
Oh, wow.
So that's the second thing, right? All of us are probably going to, experience a landslide or a heat wave or a cyclone or, floods or something, right?
Wherever we are, there is some
Wherever we are, right?
extreme weather event we may be.
Yeah, wherever we are. If you're in a city, it's happening. Like, Mumbai has floods. Delhi had floods last year. Bangalore had floods last year, right? It's happening in the hills. It's happening it's happening everywhere, right? Then it's going to affect our food systems because a lot of our food systems are under stress because we are going to face water scarcity because of changes in weather patterns. We may not be able to grow some crops, where they were currently growing, and so it is going to put stress on our food systems, and it may affect the food that we eat, right? it is going to, maybe affect our ability to, be outdoors, right? So in an extreme heat wave, you may not be able to, step out, right? Uh, by the way, and this maybe not too far in the future, you might just have to do remote work on certain days of heat waves because, it's just not feasible to really go out. Yeah. And by the way, that's for people who have the luxury of saying they can do remote work, right? That's not for everyone. So there are people who are, say, manual laborers working in the sun. They don't have remote work. They're still probably going to work, and it could be fatal for them, right? So I think these are just some of the ways in which, maybe it will affect all of us. Yeah. Yeah.
And if I just take a step back, just so we can understand the full system, what's the chain of events that leads to this climate change? Like, what's the underlying theory here?
Like what got us here, right?
Exactly,
like why we're here in the first place. So it's our doing, to put it very simply. You, me, and all the other like billion people on this planet, and the other billion who've lived for the last 100 years have brought this about, right? If we just look at it, maybe, over the last 100 years, what has happened? Because the impacts is something that maybe we've seen over the last 60, 70 years, right? So what happened is, 20th century beginning, industrialization, right? So started, of course, in the previous century, but we had a lot of industrialization, which means, a lot of industry, a lot of manufacturing, a lot of factories, right? And initially, of course, we had all of this was driven by coal, right? And we started expanding all of this manufacturing, and coal was kind of driving this, right? The industrial revolution was what has driven growth in the 20th century, right? It's the wonder of the 20th century, so to say.
Driven economic growth.
Yes, of course, right? As in growth.
Right.
Then what also started happening is then we discovered fossil fuel, of course, previously, but fossil fuel, we discovered more and more sources of fossil fuel, and we discovered more and more things you could do with it, right? And then we also found more and more ways to kind of use it, right? So you had a lot more cars, you had a lot more shipping, with all of this happening, all of this is basically human activity. A lot of human activity is eventually driven by energy. A lot of this energy was basically coming from either coal or oil or natural gas, petroleum, some form of fossil fuel, right? And how does fossil fuel give us energy? What do? We burn it, right? And what happens when you burn any of the fossil fuel, right? You're burning carbon, because all this is carbon, right? And when you burn carbon, you get carbon dioxide. So we were basically emitting out a lot of this carbon dioxide, which was going into the atmosphere. And so over the years, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased significantly. So to just give you some scale, it has basically gone from about 280 ppm, that's parts per million, pre-1950s, to 420 parts per million right now, right? It's a staggering increase, right? And what carbon dioxide does is carbon dioxide, does something called the greenhouse effect. So the simplest way to understand it is that it forms a blanket around the earth. The thickness of this blanket depends upon the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
So we now have a thicker blanket.
Yes.
420 ppm thick.
Yeah, so you have a thicker blanket, which means that the earth is going to feel warmer, right? And the blanket is becoming so thick that the warm is not comfortable anymore, right? So that's basically, what started happening. Just to be clear, carbon dioxide is not the only gas that does this. There's a few other gases which are all called together greenhouse gases. The ones you will hear about most often are methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorocarbons. So all of them do the same effect, but carbon dioxide is by far the largest contributor to this effect, right? And they started these gases together started, with the greenhouse effect warming up the earth, and that's kind of what has gotten the temperatures to increase, right? And basically, we started measuring how much have the temperatures deviated, because the temperatures will change year on year, right? One year is slightly hotter, one year is slightly lower, that's fine. But what we started seeing is that the average started changing a lot. So like this decade is, a lot hotter than the previous decade, and it's much, much hotter than what it was 100 years back. So the baseline we take is what we call the pre-industrial average, which is the average of the 1850 to 1900 temperatures, and we now calculate how much we are deviating from there, right? 2000 to 2010 was on an average about 0.7 to 0.8 degrees higher, but 2023, the single year, just 1 year, was almost 1.4 degrees higher compared to the 1850 to 1900 average, and that's a lot.
Why is it a lot? It doesn't sound like a lot.
Okay, yeah, fair, right?
1.4 degrees, like
yeah,
30 to 31.4. That's okay.
Yeah, so exactly, right? You're like, hey, it's 30, I'm okay, 31.4, I'll be slightly uncomfortable, I'll still be okay, right? So no, it doesn't really work like that, and I'll tell you why. So there are two things here. One is the 1.4 right now is an average, which means, and how is the average taken? The average is taken over all days of the year and all places on the earth.
Okay.
Right? So on a particular day, in a particular place, it would get extremely uncomfortable. Because first of all, even if it's just 1.4, going from 30 to 31.4 is very different from going from 42 to 43.4. Right? At that level, even 1 degree Celsius can make you a lot more uncomfortable. Right?
And it'll be more of a line between life and death than comfort.
Yeah, then comfort and discomfort. Right. Exactly, right? So that's number one. And number two, not all places in the earth are heating up at the same level. Right? Some places are heating up a lot more than others, and therefore some places will get a lot more impacted than others. Right? And finally, this is not limited to heating. These changes in temperature are, leading to other changes, right? Like the polar ice caps melting, glaciers melting, right? Sea levels to increase. And these changes in temperature could cause very significant increases in sea level, which could literally cause some island nations to completely submerge.
Yeah. And tell me this. So I think it was in 2015 or so, I was at an event, and I think it was the Prime Minister of Iceland at that time. He was saying that our ice caps have melted, and now finally we are able to see the ground. So now we are inviting oil companies to come and dig so that they can collect oil. At that time, they used to call it sustainability. Now we're talking about climate change, we're talking about climate adaptation, climate resilience, climate mitigation. I mean, there are all these things that have happened. So can you help connect the dots in terms of what's been the story of that movement? And if I talk about the Prime Minister of Iceland at that time, at what time does he shift his point of view from what he was saying then, saying, let me try to get maximum returns from this change in weather or climate, to what is probably the popular point of view today?
This movement, in a way, probably started in the early 90s. So I think by the 80s, it was very clear that there is something, very off about the weather patterns, right? I think by 80s, that trend was clear. The temperature increases are not normal. We are seeing an upward trend, right? So basically, instead of just seeing an up and down in the same range, we were seeing an up and down, but it was clearly trending up. I think that is very clear to the scientific community. The scientific community has been calling it out, by the way, from the 60s and 70s, but no one was listening to them. By the 80s, the voice started getting larger and the temperature started just showing, right? It was the evidence started becoming clearer. So in 1992, you had something called the Earth Summit in Rio. That's the first time, I think all the countries in the world who are a part of the United Nations came together and, kind of acknowledged that this is a problem. This is a global problem, and this is a challenge at a global level that needs all of us to come together, right? The Earth Summit is what led to the creation of the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC is a United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it is it's like the main body. It's a United Nations body.
So it's an organization.
It's an organization.
A convention is an organization.
Yeah, it's an organization. It's an organization that is within the United Nations umbrella, and it is a main body that is responsible for taking all actions to address climate change, right, within the United Nations. So the 92 Earth Summit is when the UNFCCC got formed, right? And so I think it's very clear that at that point, all these countries got together formed this whole body. So they all acknowledged that this is a problem, right? So I think that we can say is definitely a point at which there was global acknowledgement that this is a problem, we got to do something about it, right? So the UNFCCC then started the COP. So COP is the Conference of Parties. It's just a term, but it's basically, it's like the biggest meeting on climate change.
Under UNFCCC.
Under UNFCCC, the UNFCCC organizes the COP. They are the organizing body. They did the first COP in 1995 in Germany. Post that, a COP happens every year. And then it's a serial order, COP 1, COP 2, COP 3, right? So last year we had COP 28. The COP is where all the nations, so all member parties of the United Nations come together. It's typically like a 2-week event. And that's where, a lot of the global policies, consensus, country-wise commitments get formed on what are we doing about climate change, right? One of the most, you can say, important or, seminal COPs has been COP 21 that took place in Paris.
Paris Accord.
Which led to the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is where all the countries set together, they committed to take actions to try and limit global warming to 1.5 or maximum 2 degrees C. Right. So that's you can say kind of the history. So we are all centered around this idea of emissions because we know that the biggest reason has been greenhouse gases that is linked to emissions. And that's why we keep talking in terms of emissions. The goals are also in terms of saying net zero. We want to go to net zero emissions.
What does that mean? Just so we are all clear.
Okay, so we just spoke a little bit earlier about how the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is what is warming it up, right? So, and every year, like so far, at least for the last 100 years, we have been adding more and more of these emissions into the atmosphere. So net we add emissions into the atmosphere, right?
But quickly, what do you mean we are only adding to the atmosphere? What does it mean to take it away from the atmosphere? So
basically, like we said, the concentration of carbon dioxide is increasing, right? It means we're adding more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Okay, how do you take it out?
So there are ways in which you can say take it out. There are, for example, forests are carbon dioxide sinks, which means the forest ecosystem by itself would net take carbon dioxide emissions out. So that it will be a negative in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, right? But a car going on the road is emitting carbon dioxide out, and therefore it is creating carbon dioxide emissions, right? So those are the nature-based ways. There are also engineered ways, and maybe we'll talk about it a little later. But so emissions, we have been increasing emissions, right? So a lot of the current narrative around climate change is centered on emissions because that you can say is the biggest culprit, okay, driver. There are, by the way, other things also that maybe we should talk about, we can talk about, right? Like for example, it is also leading to species extinction, right? We should maybe also just care about our forests without its link to emissions, okay? And those are things that come up, but the primary metric everyone talks about is emissions. So over years, of course, a lot has changed, right? We have come from in 92, which is acknowledged it's a problem and we should do something about it. Then there was the Kyoto Protocol that happened a couple of years later, where we said we need to take some targets, right? Every country needs to take a target. Then you finally had Paris, where there was a number given to it, right? We said, hey, now we all need to make plans to try and stay within the 1.5 to 2 degrees C. COP 28, by the way, was the first time that fossil fuels have been called out very clearly as something that we need to stop in order to so it's a slow process. The COP is an extremely slow process because, by the way, the COP works by consensus. So COP doesn't work by majority. A resolution gets passed in the COP only if everyone agrees to it. So which is why it's a slow process.
Which also, I guess, means that having something agreed is a big deal.
Yeah. So getting something agreed in the COP is really a big deal. But I think the philosophy for the COP has been that it's very important that everybody really buys in. Okay, and therefore we don't want resolutions that get passed where people are not agreed, because then they will anyway not go back and do it. Right. And so we would rather agree on something maybe that's not as ambitious but have everybody do it.
Got it. And one quick clarification, 1.52 degrees Celsius increase compared to what?
Yeah, so we always compare the increase to the what we call the pre-industrial average,
Okay.
which is the temperatures the world saw
Before all this story
before
started,
all
right?
this story started, which is the 1850 to 1900. That average is taken as a pre-industrial average, and we are now measuring how much higher temperatures are compared to that. Right, and the world said that we have to keep the long-term average. See, again, long-term average means you take an average over like a few years, maybe a decade, right? So if in 1 year the temperature becomes 1.5 more, but next year it's lower, we will not consider we've reached the mark. We will consider we've reached the mark if it sustains. So for a decade, if the decade's average is more than that, then we'll say we've reached the mark. What the world leaders have agreed is we will try to keep this long-term average within 1.5 of the pre-industrial average.
Where are we today if I look at the...
So the average, if you look at a decade's average, we're at about a 1.1, 1.2, about a 1.1. But the 2023, just 2023 was at about a 1.4. So you might have heard the terms El Nino, La Nina, right? And people are like, oh, that's why it's hot, or that's why it's not raining, right? So to tell you. So we spoke about some variations within year to year also, right? So I said everything it used to remain a range, but still there are some hotter years, there are some lower years. So one of the factors that affects a certain year being hotter than the other is what you call El Nino and La Nina. They are basically weather patterns in the Pacific Ocean.
Okay.
But they are weather patterns in the Pacific Ocean, but they're very important because those patterns somehow almost have the power to impact the climate for the entire Earth, right? So El Nino is the kind of weather pattern which typically causes warming in the Pacific Ocean, right? And La Nina is the opposite, which causes cooling.
Okay.
A lot of places will have typically higher temperatures in El Nino, including India. So India also sees higher temperatures in El Nino compared to La Nina. Second thing is it affects cyclones and hurricanes. Then some other countries, like for example, Australia tends to see droughts during El Nino. Okay. Right? In India, El Nino typically also brings a weaker monsoon. So India also sees lesser rainfall, and El Nino is a pattern that will say last for a few months at a stretch, and it can come every 2 to 7 years. So it's not very regular. You can't fully predict when an El Nino will come, when a La Nina will come.
And so essentially El Nino, La Nina are natural phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's a term given for a set of things conspiring to become a change in weather conditions.
Yes. And El Nino, so we have been experiencing like an El Nino weather pattern from around June last year.
Okay.
So June 2023, the El Nino started. It is still going on, and it is expected to weaken in a couple of...
April 2024.
Yeah. It's a long El Nino, and it's expected to weaken in a couple of months actually.
Okay.
And we're hoping it will, because if it will, then it means India will get a good monsoon. Okay. So the 23 monsoon wasn't the best monsoon for India. One of the contributing factors was El Nino, right? So 2023 was therefore in a way an El Nino year, and that's also why its temperatures are very hot, right? So the way you should think about it is climate change is causing an overall increase in temperature. El Nino is adding fuel to the fire.
Right.
Right? So El Nino is what is making that particular year even hotter. So if it was only El Nino without climate change, we would have had a hot year, but we would not have had the hottest year on record. Right. 2023 was the hottest year we've ever seen.
Oh wow.
That has happened only with a combination of climate change and El Nino.
Got it. Helpful. Okay. So specifically in the whole history of the movement, so when did this conversation change from sustainability and sustainable practices to now the term that I'm hearing is climate adaptation, climate resilience, along with climate mitigation? So are we losing hope, facing realities? What's going on?
So there's mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, right? These are the terms that you will hear in the context of climate solutions. Mitigation is what you do today to make the future better. So what can I do today to make sure that the temperatures don't go beyond 2 degrees Celsius 2 decades later, right? That is mitigation. And so mitigation is a lot about doing things that will reduce emissions, right? Because when you're reducing emissions, you will prevent greenhouse effect in the future, and therefore temperature rise will probably get
Hopefully
arrested.
right.
Yeah, that's all mitigation. So for example, if you ever say we build a solar power plant, it is going to replace fossil fuel, it will reduce emissions. It's a solution that comes under mitigation, right?
Right.
Adaptation is saying that, hey, now some part of the damage is done. Because of everything that we have done, we're already seeing impacts, right? And that you can't prevent. Like, even if you make emissions zero today, some things are going to happen.
Right.
Like cyclones are already happening, heat waves are already happening. Now, everything you need to do to allow people to adjust to these impacts, right? Prevent or reduce loss of life and infrastructure is what is adaptation, right? Resilience is how can we build our capabilities to one, maybe forecast some of this and also recover faster, right? So that's building resilience. So
What do you mean by that?
so for example, you could have an early warning system, right? So when you have cyclones, right? If you have an early warning system, and by the way, they're getting a lot better, right? So, an interesting thing, we have much more intense cyclones and, hurricanes now, but we have a lot less loss of life. Because, for example, our systems have become, we can warn, we know cyclones are coming and you're able to evacuate people, which we could not do earlier, right? So, interesting, Bangladesh gets some of the worst cyclones, right? But Bangladesh now has a record that in most of their recent cyclones, they've not lost a single life. They have become so good at disaster mitigation, right? And that's the second part of resilience. So, and then how can you recover faster? So, after say an extreme weather event has happened, right? You've lost infrastructure. How can you just build back faster? So that's resilience, right? That's how do you build resilience? Because, and even resilience comes from the point of view that, hey, some part of the damage is locked in,
right?
And so we have to address it, right? We have to do something to kind of reduce the impact that is going to cause on humans and other living beings and infrastructure.
Got it. And so, if we now shift the lens to talking about solutions and action that people are taking, what are the different strands of work that is ongoing? What are the different types of solutions that people are working on today?
So, okay, we'll talk about some of the, you can say, areas in which, work is happening and work needs to happen to kind of address the challenge. So, there's one part about decarbonizing the grid, right? And what that means is we all need electricity, right? And that's a lot of emissions come from electricity because a lot of our electricity is still fossil fuel powered, right? So the first part is just about saying how can we make our electricity clean? And when I say clean, can it come from sources that are not fossil fuels? So can it come from sources that is not coal, that is not gas, that is not oil? So what does that mean? That means renewable sources of power, which means solar energy or wind energy or hydrothermal or even nuclear, right? Or you have newer things like say tidal, right? These are all called renewable sources of power because they are perennial sources. Like the sun is, we are not going to run out of sun, right? And where the term came from is, the research into these or actually started because at some point we were dependent on fossil fuels and the world was worried that we would run out of fossil fuels. Right? Because fossil fuel was a limited source and therefore they were looking at sources which were perennial, and so sun was one of them and maybe solar, wind, etc. And they were called renewable sources of power, right? This entire thing works towards the goal, the first part of saying, can we have 100% clean electricity?
Right.
And there's a lot that needs to happen to make that happen, right? You need to generate electricity from renewable wind, etc. You need to be able to manage the intermittency because the biggest problem with renewables is that it's not there all day, right? The sun doesn't shine all day.
It shines all day, it doesn't shine all night. Yeah.
Good one. Yeah. So the sun doesn't shine all night, right? Wind may not blow when you want it to blow, right? You have hydrothermal, but there could be a drought.
Right.
So they come with their challenges,
It's an
right?
inherent variability in
There's an
the
inherent variability which you can't control.
right.
And therefore, you need to build around these systems. Therefore, a lot of work needs to happen into that. Number two is, it's quite focused on transportation, because transportation is a big part of our emissions. A lot of our emissions come from, road transport, come from shipping, come from aviation, right? And so this part is about how do we make mobility, how do we reduce emissions from mobility? And this has things like, electric vehicles, right? Can we make cheaper electric vehicles? Can we increase the efficiency of electric vehicles? Can we increase the charge, capacity? Can we have faster charging? Because all of this will make the adoption of electric vehicles faster, right?
Right.
This, by the way, this part also includes solutions like, can we increase the use of public transport, right? Because that's, by the way, one of the best levers to reduce emissions from transportation, right? Public transport is a lot more efficient. A lot of the ways are cleaner, right? Because they run on electricity. Number three is about everything on food and agriculture. So, we spoke very briefly about how agricultural systems, would get impacted because of, climate change. There's another angle where agriculture also contributes to emissions. Just to begin with, right, to grow crops somewhere, if you are converting forested land into agricultural land, just by changing that, use of land, you are actually making that piece of land a carbon emitter from a carbon sink. Because forests, like I said, are carbon sinks. A forest left to itself is absorbing more carbon dioxide than emitting. But an agricultural piece of land is emitting more carbon dioxide because you cut the crop at the end of it and you do something with it, and it ends up burning the carbon
Right.
that is stored in the plant, right? So just by change of land use, you are first of all doing emissions. Secondly, to do agriculture, you need fertilizer. The way agriculture is done in modern agriculture uses so much fertilizer. Fertilizer production has carbon emissions, right? A lot of it comes from fossil fuels. Then you have agriculture uses machines. All of modern agriculture uses machines. You will have tractors, you'll have harvesters. All of them run on diesel.
Right.
So again, they're emitting, right?
So in the whole value chain, supply chain, you
Yeah.
are okay.
You are
net emitting.
net
right.
you're emitting. So you also need to find solutions to reduce these emissions from agriculture, right? For example, you use pumps to pump water in agriculture.
Right.
They're also based on electricity. So, interesting solution, can we use solar pumps? It actually works really well because you'll typically use the pump in the day when the sun is shining.
And the plant also needs sun anyway, so it'll be in sunny places.
So it is in sunny places. So, actually a win-win. You need it only when the sun is shining on most days, and therefore, can you just use solar pumps, right? So there is a bunch of work that is happening and needs to happen in food and agriculture to ensure that we're able to produce the food that we need to feed the people on this planet, but at the same time reduce emissions and therefore, do it in a way which, doesn't harm the planet as much, right? Number four is basically a bunch of work needs to happen in our industries and manufacturing, right? So a lot of the products that we use very often, right, and we use in large quantities, like cement and steel, are very high emitting industries. And that's because of the nature of the way either the materials that they're using or the process that they're using. So for example, steel, to make steel, you'll have a blast furnace, right? Blast furnace is what? It's just like just a really large furnace which is like putting so much coal in it constantly, like, it's burning, right? Literally burning. So much of emission is happening there, and it has, so far, we have not found a way to reach the temperatures that a blast furnace reaches without having a blast furnace. So, a lot of these industries are also highly emitting, and we need to find ways to make these industries less emitting. So, see, of course, cement and steel are the most emitting, and so I've mentioned those, but there are a lot of others, right? So, manufacture of paper, of course, manufacture of plastics, right? A lot of these industries are emitting industries, and we need to figure out a way to reduce emissions in all of these, right? So that's number four.
And I think somewhere, I think we were having a conversation earlier. I think somewhere the point of why cement and steel is because given the direction that a
Yeah.
lot of growth, urbanization, etc. go, they typically end up using a lot of such construction material to build roads, build buildings, etc.
Yeah, absolutely right. So, see, and especially if you look at India and where India is right now, India is still a developing country. India has huge ambitions. We want to grow, and uh, so all that growth is going to mean that we build more infrastructure. It is going to mean that our cities grow even more. It is going to mean that we build more flyovers. It is going to mean that we build more buildings. All of that is going to need cement and steel. So we don't honestly have the option of saying we will stop making cement and steel. And therefore, the only option we have is to say how will we make it in a better manner.
Or how do we find alternate materials?
Or yes, of course. Or how do you find alternate materials, right? And that's the other thing that can come in here. That can you find alternate materials? So can you use something which is does the same purpose but is not this
strongly emitting? Sure.
Yeah. So that's your number 4, right? Then number 5 that I talk about is basically waste and circularity, and this is it overlaps a little. It can overlap a little bit with the with industries and how they are emitting, because one way to reduce their emissions is to make processes circular. But I talk about it separately because there's a lot of interesting work happening in the space of circularity, and so I would like to call it out as a just a separate vertical in itself, right? So what is circularity? It is simply think of a process in which so you have raw materials, you make a product, it gets used, but at the end of the life cycle it finds another use, and therefore it becomes like a new product in a way. Instead of a linear value chain where something is made, gets used and is discarded, you have a circular value chain where something is made, gets used and then remade into something else and becomes a new product, right? Now, why is this so important? Like, why is circularity so important? It does two things. One is, when instead of having a linear value chain, you have a circular value chain, you reduce the need of fresh raw material right in the beginning, right? So, say for example, there's certain metal you're using to make something. Now, one way to do it is you are taking raw metal that you have mined from a mine, it's virgin metal, right? But if you're able to do the same thing using scrap metal, you will reduce the need for that metal that's coming from the mine, and therefore you reduce the need for mining in the first place, right? And that's an amazing advantage, right? So that's number 1. And number 2 is because you're using the waste, you're reducing the amount of waste that you're having to, discard and deal with, right? And because waste is a big problem, right? In most places, like at least in most developing countries, a lot of waste just goes to the landfill and then it is burnt. And that's terrible for the environment, right? Because the waste is getting burnt, so much emission, really bad air pollution, sometimes toxic gases. So all of that you can avoid, which is why circularity is a win-win. And there's a bunch of interesting work happening in circularity, right? People are using agricultural waste to make leather alternatives. People are using agricultural waste to make like a silica alternative, right? People are using agricultural waste to make a black carbon alternative. So it's amazing the range of things that people are actually doing, right? So that's and therefore that's the other thing that comes under waste and circularity, which was number 5. Number 6 is basically a lot of efforts on conservation, right? So I briefly mentioned that forests act as carbon sinks.
Right.
So there's a lot of natural habitats, and mostly which are like say heavily forested or wetlands, which act as one carbon sinks, and they have a lot of advantages in regulating some of these you could say environmental patterns, right? So for example, mangroves do a great job at reducing the intensity of storms,
right,
and therefore protect the ecosystem, right? And therefore there's a bunch of efforts that is actually happening on conserving some of these ecosystems and also restoring it, or trying to bring them back in some places where we've completely lost them,
right.
And that can also have a huge impact, because that can actually you were mentioning how can we remove carbon dioxide. So there are some ways in which you can actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and these are all nature-based practices to remove for carbon dioxide removal.
And conservation essentially helps.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not just on land, by the way. You can also do coastal ecosystem conservation, because a lot of coastal plants, etc., can absorb a lot of carbon dioxide. So,
Got it.
right? So that's number 6. And finally, number 7 is actually carbon dioxide removal, but engineered practices for carbon dioxide removal. So now this will sound very funky, but you actually have technology which can literally absorb carbon dioxide from the air and then go and store it somewhere in the earth and hopefully lock it away forever.
Okay.
Right? But again, it sounds very cool. Problem is it's extremely nascent. There is no scale to it at all. But that's, I think, another area in which people are working. Now this last area, maybe I'll take a minute. There are a few sides to think of it, right? And it's also a little controversial. A lot of people don't like it. So I'll tell you both the sides. So there is one narrative which says that no, this engineered carbon removal is the best thing ever, and that's going to change our world, right? You want to take a guess at who are the people who think it's the best thing ever?
Engineers. Tech bros.
Yeah, I'm sure the ones who did it, yes. But the fossil fuel companies, right?
Okay.
Because that gives them a license in a way to keep emitting, because then
Interesting.
they
Okay.
can say that hey, you can emit, it's okay, because you can emit whatever you want, because
So
now I
just
have this
suck it.
amazing technology to take it all back.
Right. Okay.
So COP28 this year, apparently when people went into Dubai, there were these big hoardings of direct air capture. It's called DAC, direct air capture of carbon dioxide. There's a lot of skepticism around it, and a lot of people say, hey, this is just a distraction. It's distracting from the real issue, right?
Right.
What we really need to do is really stop using fossil fuel.
Right.
And all of this talk is a distraction. We should not get into it, right? If you ask me, is it like distraction? Is it not needed at all? I do think it's needed, right? I do think we will need carbon removal technologies, because our goal is to get to net zero, which means we should not be emitting any carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Net zero means that through everything that I do, through all the activities that the world is doing, we should not be putting any additional carbon into the atmosphere.
Right.
Now, there are some sectors which will be able to become net zero by themselves.
Right.
Like today, technically, we can think of a world in which entire road transportation becomes net zero, because you can have only electric vehicles and you can have fully clean electricity, and therefore it can be net zero, right? But we don't today have enough technology to say we'll be able to make aviation net zero, right? Because we don't have an electric airplane. We don't have the technology yet, right? So there will be some sectors which we call hard to abate sectors, which will continue to emit. Now, if some sectors are continuing to emit, somebody needs to go negative. That's the only way you will end up at zero. And therefore, you do need some negative carbon technologies, right? That said, that is going to probably solve like 10% of the problem.
Right.
Okay? Which means that the remaining 90%, we still need to just stop emitting.
Right.
Which means that fossil fuels have to stop. So, like my view on this is, there is no doubt that we need to stop burning fossil fuels. We need direct air capture, but that does not mean we can continue burning fossil fuels. That is a buffer we have for some very hard to abate sectors, and that is only going to still solve only 5% of the problem, which means 95 to 10%, 90% is still going to be cutting emissions where we can and doing the hard work of stopping the burning of fossil fuels.
If there are streams of work, who's actually working towards them? What does that look like? And just want to address this. What is eco-anxiety? If you were to share 3 do's and 1 don't for the audience, what would they be?